In January 2024, one of the most photographed women in the world vanished. No explanation, no cameras, no public appearances, just silence, and a carefully worded palace statement about a planned abdominal surgery. The world waited, and waited. Spring arrived. She didn't. What happened behind the scenes during those weeks, the results no one had anticipated, the conversations that stretched long into the night, the words a mother chose carefully to say to her own children, is a story no official statement could contain. Who was the woman behind a decade of carefully constructed perfection, watched by millions? What did the diagnosis reveal when it stripped away the princess and left only the person? And what happens when someone trained for years to never falter in public decides, for the first time, to simply tell the truth? Before we answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, to a girl from Bucklebury who was never raised to be a princess. She was never supposed to be a princess, not in the way fairy tales imagine it. Born into velvet rooms, raised on titles, trained from birth to wear a crown with practiced ease, Catherine Elizabeth Middleton arrived into the world on January 9, 1982, in Reading, Berkshire, the eldest daughter of Michael and Carol Middleton. Her father, a former flight dispatcher. Her mother, a former flight attendant who would later build a party supply empire from a spare bedroom. Comfortable, yes. Royal, no. Bucklebury, the small village in Berkshire where Catherine grew up, was the kind of place that exists quietly at the edge of history. Green fields, narrow lanes, the kind of childhood measured not in palaces but in muddy boots and school runs and Saturday mornings that smelled of fresh bread. It was ordinary in the most extraordinary sense. Warm, grounded, real, and that groundedness, that unshakable sense of who she was before the world decided who she should be, would become the invisible armor she carried into every royal engagement, every camera flash, every moment of pressure that would follow. At school, Catherine was not a headline. She was a hockey player, a swimmer, a girl who worked quietly and consistently without demanding to be noticed. At Marlborough College, where she boarded from the age of 13, she was remembered not for scandal or spectacle, but for steadiness. She studied hard. She made friends carefully. She moved through rooms without needing to own them. It was at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where the trajectory of her life changed forever. She arrived in 2001 to study art history, and in her first year, she met a young man named William, who happened to be the future King of England. Their friendship grew slowly, naturally, without the breathless drama the tabloids would later invent. They were flatmates first, then friends, then something more. But the road from St. Andrews to Westminster Abbey was not paved with romance alone. It was paved with a particular kind of endurance that few could have survived. For nearly a decade, Catherine existed in a space that had no name and no precedent. She was William's girlfriend, a role that carried enormous public scrutiny, but zero official protection. The press pursued her relentlessly. Photographers camped outside her flat. Tabloids dissected her appearance, her family, her intentions. She was simultaneously too ordinary and too ambitious, too polished, and not royal enough. And through all of it, she said almost nothing. That silence, misread by critics as passivity, dismissed by commentators as blandness, was in fact something far more deliberate. Catherine had understood something early that most people spend a lifetime learning. That in a world addicted to noise, the most powerful thing a person can do is choose when to speak. In 2007, William ended their relationship. The press declared her finished. Another casualty of royal ambition, another ordinary girl who had reached too high and fallen quietly back to earth. But Catherine did not collapse. She traveled. She worked. She rebuilt herself without the scaffolding of his presence. And when he came back, when he realized what he had let go, she returned not as someone desperate for rescue, but as someone who had proven she did not need it. On April 29, 2011, she walked through the doors of Westminster Abbey in a dress that would be studied and recreated for decades, and she became Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge. The world erupted. Street parties stretched across Britain. Television cameras reached into living rooms in every corner of the globe. But what the cameras could not capture, what no headline could contain, was the weight that arrived with the title. Because from that morning forward, Catherine's life belonged not to herself, but to the institution she had married into. Every appearance was choreographed, every expression monitored, every outfit analyzed, every word measured, every gesture catalogued. She was expected to be warm but not familiar, modern but not radical, accessible but not informal. She was expected to be everything, and to make it look effortless. She had 3 children, George in 2013, Charlotte in 2015, Louis in 2018. Each pregnancy played out in public before she was ready. Announced not when she chose, but when hyperemesis gravidarum, the severe and debilitating form of morning sickness that left her hospitalized, made concealment impossible. Each time, her body's vulnerability became front-page news before she had even told her own extended family. And still, she smiled. Still, she waved. Still, she showed up. What looked like composure to the world was, in truth, something more complicated. It was discipline. It was duty. It was the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent over a decade learning to compress herself into a shape that fit an institution, while the full, complex, feeling person inside continued to exist in private, unseen, unacknowledged. That person, the one behind the photographs, behind the hats and the handshakes and the carefully prepared speeches, is the one who would eventually be forced into the light. Not by choice, but by diagnosis. The Perfect Princess and the Invisible Price. By 2022, Catherine, Princess of Wales, had become something the royal family had not possessed in a very long time. An asset. Not in the cold, transactional sense, though the institution understood her value in precisely those terms, but in the deeper, more cultural sense. She had become the face that steadied the monarchy during its most turbulent decade in living memory, when Prince Andrew's reputation collapsed under the weight of scandal, when Harry and Meghan's departure cracked the royal image across every front page in the world, when Queen Elizabeth's health began its slow and inevitable decline. Through all of it, Catherine stood. Photographs from this period tell a story that words almost cannot. There she is at the Commonwealth Games, laughing with athletes. There she is in Ukraine's colors, standing beside Volodymyr Zelensky's wife in a quiet act of solidarity. There she is at Wimbledon, at the trooping of the color, at school visits and hospital openings and memorial services. Always present, always composed, always exactly what the moment required. The public adored her. Approval ratings that would make politicians weep. Fashion searches that crashed websites within minutes of an appearance. A following that spanned continents and generations, from elderly women who saw in her the grace of a younger Queen Elizabeth, to young girls who saw something they had not expected to find in a princess. Someone who seemed, somehow, real. But behind the photographs, a different story was being written. Those closest to Catherine during this period speak carefully, even now. But the outlines of what they describe are consistent. The schedule was relentless, not simply busy, relentless in the way that grinds quietly, invisibly, until something gives. Early mornings, late evenings, engagements stacked against each other with barely enough space to breathe between them. Public events requiring total emotional presence, the kind that leaves a person hollowed out by evening, too tired for conversation, too wired for sleep. And underneath the schedule, something quieter and more corrosive. The particular loneliness of performing constant perfection in front of an audience of millions. Every stumble magnified, every expression scrutinized, every human moment. A tired face, a distracted glance, a coat worn twice, transformed into a headline, or a criticism or a think piece about what it meant. She was not allowed to be ordinary. And the cost of that, borne silently, privately, across years, was accumulating in ways that no royal calendar could measure. There were signs, in retrospect, that those around her recognized but did not fully name. A thinness in her face during late 2023 engagements that photographers noticed but editors softened. A fatigue in her eyes that makeup could not entirely conceal. Moments at public events where the smile held, but something behind it seemed to be working harder than usual to stay in place. Catherine herself has since spoken, in the measured language she always chooses, about the period leading up to her diagnosis as one in which she was aware that something was not right. Not dramatically, not with the sudden alarm of a crisis arriving all at once, but in the quieter, more insidious way that the body begins to send signals that the mind, trained to override discomfort in the service of duty, finds easy to dismiss. She dismissed them because she had been trained by the institution, by the role, by a decade of learning to compress her own needs into whatever space remained after everything else had been attended to dismiss them. And then, in the final weeks of 2023, dismissal became impossible. The details of what followed have been shared only in fragments, and deliberately so. Catherine has been consistent and clear about her right to medical privacy, a boundary she has defended not defensively, but with the quiet firmness of someone who learned the hard way that the space between public duty and private self must be actively protected or it will be consumed entirely. What is known is this. In January 2024, Catherine underwent what the palace described as planned abdominal surgery at the London clinic. The procedure was presented as routine. Recovery was expected to take several weeks. She would return to public duties in spring. What was not said, what could not yet be said, because the full picture had not yet emerged, was that the surgery had revealed something the surgeons had not anticipated, something that would require further investigation, and that the results of those investigations would change everything. For several weeks after the surgery, as Catherine recovered in private and the palace maintained its carefully worded silence, the medical team worked. Tests were conducted, results were analyzed, conversations were had in the hushed, precise language of oncology, a language that, once spoken in your direction, divides your life permanently into before and after. Catherine has described the weeks between her surgery and her diagnosis as the most difficult of her life, not because of physical pain alone, though that was real and significant, but because of the particular anguish of waiting, of knowing that something is wrong without yet knowing the full shape of what wrong means, of lying in a hospital bed or a recovery room while the world outside continued its ordinary motion, school runs, television schedules, weekend plans, and feeling the distance between that ordinary world and the extraordinary thing happening inside your own body grow wider with every passing hour. William was with her throughout. This detail, small as it sounds, is not small because William's presence, his choice to step back from public duties, to cancel engagements, to be physically, consistently present during those weeks, was itself a statement, not made in words, but in the language of proximity, of choosing, when choice was possible, to be in the room. Their children were told in a way that was age-appropriate and careful. George, Charlotte, and Louis were shielded from the full weight of what their parents were navigating, but not from the truth that their mother was unwell and needed time to heal. Catherine has since spoken about the importance of that honesty, of not building a wall of false cheerfulness around something real and frightening, of trusting her children, even young ones, with a version of the truth they could hold. And then the results came, and the waiting ended, and a different kind of work began. Cancer does not arrive with drama. It does not announce itself with the crash of thunder or the flare of sudden pain that leaves no room for doubt. It arrives quietly, in a report, in a number, in the measured voice of a doctor who has delivered this particular sentence more times than any human being should have to, and who has learned, through that repetition, exactly how to hold the space between the words and the moment they land. Catherine has described the moment of her diagnosis with the careful precision of someone who has spent a great deal of time trying to find language adequate to an experience that resists it. She was told that cancer had been found during her surgery, that it had been unexpected, that it would require a course of preventative chemotherapy, and that the road ahead would be long, uncertain, and nothing like anything she had navigated before. She has said that her initial reaction was shock. That word, shock, is easy to read past, but sit with it for a moment. This was a woman of 42, physically active, publicly composed, privately disciplined. A woman who had spent more than a decade building a life around the management of the unexpected, around showing up, holding steady, absorbing pressure without visibly buckling. And now she was being told that none of that preparation, none of that discipline, none of that carefully constructed armor meant anything at all in the face of what was happening inside her own body. The institution that had shaped her every public move for over a decade could not protect her from this. The schedule that had defined her days could not be managed around it. The smile that had steadied a monarchy could not be deployed in the oncologist's office. For the first time in her public life, Catherine was in a situation that required not performance, but surrender, not composure, but grief. And she grieved, in private, in the way that people who have spent years learning to contain their emotions in public learn to release them only when the doors are closed and the cameras are gone, and there is no one left to be strong for except themselves. What followed, in the weeks after the diagnosis, was a period of profound internal reckoning that Catherine has since described with unusual openness. Unusual, at least, for a woman trained in the royal art of saying much while revealing little. She spoke of the need to find the right way to tell her children, of conversations with William that went long into the night, of the particular grief of a parent facing serious illness, not the fear of death itself, though that fear was present, but the more immediate and more specific fear of what her absence, even temporary, would mean for the three small people who depended on her presence as naturally as they depended on air. George was 10. Charlotte was 8. Louis was 5. She told them herself, in her own words, in language she had chosen carefully, sitting with William in the particular quiet of a conversation that no parent should ever have to have. She has said that their response, the way children absorb difficult truths with a directness that adults, trained to soften and qualify, have often forgotten, gave her something she had not expected. Courage, not the manufactured courage of public performance, but the raw, immediate courage of a mother who looks at her children's faces and understands with absolute clarity that the most important thing she can do is fight. Outside the family, the silence continued. The palace maintained its careful position. Catherine was recovering from surgery. She would return to duties when she was well enough. There was nothing further to add. The statement was accurate in every word and incomplete in every implication. A masterclass in the royal institution's centuries-old practice of managing information as a tool of stability. But the silence created its own storm. In the absence of information, the internet did what the internet does. It speculated, wildly, relentlessly. Conspiracy theories multiplied with a speed that would have seemed impossible in any previous era. Some claimed Catherine had never had surgery at all. Others insisted the palace was concealing something far more sinister than illness: a marital collapse, a nervous breakdown, a scandal of dimensions not yet visible. Photographs were analyzed frame by frame. Old videos were slowed and reversed. Experts who were not experts offered diagnoses on platforms built for engagement rather than accuracy. And then came the photograph. On March 10, 2024, the palace released an image of Catherine with her 3 children, taken to mark Mother's Day in the United Kingdom. It was intended to reassure, to offer the public a glimpse of a recovering woman, smiling, surrounded by the people she loved most. Instead, it detonated. Within hours, major international news agencies, Associated Press, Reuters, Agence France Presse, issued what is known in journalism as a kill notice, a formal retraction. The photograph, they determined, showed signs of digital manipulation. Details had been altered. The image, far from offering reassurance, had raised more questions than it answered. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Catherine issued a rare personal statement, apologizing for the confusion and taking responsibility for the editing. It was a small, human admission, the kind of thing that anyone who has ever adjusted a photograph on a phone would recognize. But in the context of weeks of silence and mounting speculation, it was read as confirmation of everything the conspiracy theorists had been claiming. The institution had not been transparent. Something was being hidden. The photograph had been manipulated. What else had been? The damage was significant. Not to Catherine personally. Public sympathy for her, once the full truth emerged, would prove enormous. But to the palace's management of the situation, to the carefully constructed wall of non-information that had been built around her recovery. The photograph incident cracked that wall in a way that made continued silence not just untenable, but actively harmful. And so, 12 days later, on March 22, 2024, Catherine sat in front of a camera in the garden of her home in Windsor. She had written the words herself. She spoke without notes. She looked directly into the lens. Directly, that is, at the hundreds of millions of people who would watch within hours. And she told the truth. She described the surgery, the unexpected discovery, the weeks of tests and waiting, the diagnosis, the decision, made together with William, to begin a course of preventative chemotherapy, the conversations with her children, the shock, the grief, and then, with a steadiness that silenced every remaining conspiracy theory in a single sentence, she said something that only a person speaking from the absolute center of their own experience could have said. She asked for time, for space, for the understanding that she was, like so many people watching, simply a human being trying to navigate something enormous, and that she needed, before she could be a princess again, to be a patient, a mother, a wife, a person. The response was extraordinary, not because it was unexpected. The world had been waiting for this moment, in one form or another, for months. but because of what it revealed about the relationship between Catherine and the public that had watched her for so long. The conspiracy theories evaporated almost instantly. The speculation collapsed. What replaced them was something simpler and more powerful: recognition. Millions of people who had watched from behind their screens, who had never met her, would never meet her, knew her only through the carefully curated image of a royal life, recognized in her words something deeply, uncomfortably personal. They had sat in that same oncologist's office, or they had sat beside someone who had. They had had that same conversation with their children, or they had watched a parent have it with them. They had felt that same particular mixture of fear and defiance and exhaustion and love that Catherine was describing. She was not, in that moment, a princess. She was anyone. And that, perhaps more than anything else in her extraordinary public life, was what made the world stop and listen. Chemotherapy is not a single event. It is not a dramatic moment with a clear beginning and a definitive end. It is a season, long, grinding, and relentless in ways that are almost impossible to describe to someone who has not lived inside it. It is the accumulation of days that feel identical in their difficulty. Mornings that arrive with nausea before full consciousness. Afternoons that demand rest the body cannot fully achieve. Evenings that offer exhaustion without the relief of genuine sleep. Catherine began her course of preventative chemotherapy in February 2024, weeks before she told the world it was happening. She has since spoken about those early weeks with the particular honesty of someone who has decided, after a lifetime of careful management, that the truth is more useful than the performance of strength. It was, she said, harder than she had anticipated. That admission, from a woman who had endured hyperemesis gravidarum 3 times, who had rebuilt herself after a public breakup, who had spent over a decade absorbing the pressure of royal life without visible complaint, carries enormous weight. Because if Catherine said it was hard in ways that the word barely contains. The physical effects of chemotherapy are well documented in the clinical language of medicine: fatigue, nausea, vulnerability to infection, hair thinning, the slow erosion of the body's ordinary resilience as the treatment works its way through every system, targeting not only what is dangerous, but everything in its path. For Catherine, whose public identity had been so thoroughly constructed around physical composure, the straight back, the steady walk, the face that never cracked under pressure, the experience of her own body becoming unreliable, was a particular kind of disorientation. But it was not the hardest part. The hardest part, she has said, was the ordinary life that continued around the illness. The school runs that still needed to happen. The homework that still needed supervising. The birthday parties and weekend rituals and bedtime routines that 3 young children required. Not because they were indifferent to their mother's illness, but because children need the architecture of the ordinary, even when, especially when, the extraordinary is happening. George, Charlotte, and Louis knew their mother was unwell. They knew she was receiving treatment. They knew, in the way that children know things that adults sometimes underestimate, that something serious was happening in their home. And Catherine made a choice, deliberate, considered, and consistent throughout her treatment, to be present for them even when presence cost her more than the world could see. Not performing wellness she did not feel, but showing up, sitting at the kitchen table, reading bedtime stories with a voice that was tired but there, being physically in the room, even when being in the room required everything she had. William has spoken about this period, carefully, as he speaks about everything personal, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of something that sounds very much like awe. He described Catherine during her treatment as the bravest person he knew, not brave in the public sense, not the bravery of the podium or the ceremonial moment, but brave in the private sense. The daily, unremarkable, invisible bravery of a person who gets up and shows up when every instinct is toward stillness. He also, during this period, showed up himself. This is worth pausing on. Because William, a man raised inside an institution that has historically treated emotional expression as a liability, who lost his mother at 15 in circumstances that left wounds the public has only ever partially glimpsed, chose, during Catherine's illness, a different kind of presence than royal men have traditionally offered. He reduced his public schedule. He attended medical appointments. He managed the logistics of family life with a hands-on consistency that those close to the family described as genuine rather than performative. The marriage, tested by illness in the way that all marriages are tested by illness, by fear, by role reversal, by the exposure of vulnerabilities that ordinary life allows couples to keep private, appeared to deepen rather than fracture. Those who saw them together during this period spoke of a quality between them that had not always been visible in the glossy photographs of royal engagements. Something quieter, more honest. The particular intimacy of two people who have faced something terrifying together and discovered on the other side of it that they are still standing. Through the spring and summer of 2024, as Catherine moved through her treatment, the public world outside her Windsor home continued its restless motion. Royal engagements were attended by others. Events she would normally have anchored were managed without her. The institution adapted, as institutions do, filling the gaps her absence created with a efficiency that was, in its own way, a tribute to how much ground she had been covering. Occasionally, carefully, there were glimpses. A photograph released through official channels, this time unambiguously authentic, the lessons of March having been absorbed completely, showing Catherine in a garden or walking in the countryside near her home. Images not of a princess performing recovery, but of a woman actually living it. The difference was visible, even through a screen. The ease in her posture, the lack of the particular tension that public performance requires. She looked, in these photographs, like herself, or rather, like a version of herself that the public had rarely been permitted to see. Unguarded, present, real. In June 2024, she made her first public appearance since her diagnosis. Trooping the Colour, the annual military parade celebrating the sovereign's birthday, one of the most watched events in the British royal calendar. She arrived not on horseback or in full ceremonial regalia, but in a carriage, seated beside her children. She wore pale blue, she waved, she smiled, and the crowd, which had waited months for this moment, responded with a warmth that went beyond the ordinary enthusiasm of royal occasions. Because what they were applauding was not a performance, it was a return. The return of someone they had not been certain they would see again. And the relief of her presence was visible in the faces of people lining streets who had never met her and would never meet her, but who felt in some way they would struggle to articulate that she mattered to them. She was not well, not fully. She has been clear about this. The appearance at Trooping the Colour was not a declaration of recovery, but a moment. One carefully chosen. One that cost her more than it appeared to cost her. Of reconnection. Of saying, without words, I am still here. The chemotherapy continued through the summer, and then, in September 2024, came the announcement that the world had been hoping for since March. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had completed her course of chemotherapy. She released a video, filmed outdoors, her hair longer than it had been in the spring, her face carrying the particular quality of someone who has traveled through something enormous and arrived, changed, on the other side. She spoke of gratitude, of the medical teams who had cared for her, of the extraordinary response from the public, the letters, the messages, the quiet solidarity of strangers who had shared their own cancer experiences in response to hers. She spoke of her children, of William, of the perspective that illness, brutal as it is, sometimes forces into clarity. And she spoke of something else. She spoke of the people still in the middle of their own fight, the ones who had not yet reached the moment she was describing, the ones still in the season of treatment, still counting the days between appointments, still navigating the particular exhaustion of a body at war with itself. She spoke to them directly, not from a position of triumphant survival, but from the position of someone who had been exactly where they were, and who wanted them to know, with the quiet authority of lived experience, that the other side existed. It was, by any measure, one of the most powerful pieces of communication produced by any member of the British royal family in living memory. Not because of its production quality, or its careful messaging, or the strategic calculation of its timing, but because it was true, unmistakably, uncomplicatedly, completely true. And the world, which had spent months filling the silence with speculation and conspiracy and noise, fell quiet to listen. In the months that followed her chemotherapy completion, Catherine moved carefully back into public life. Not with the breathless schedule of before, not the stacked engagements and the relentless calendar that had defined her pre-diagnosis years, but with a deliberateness that spoke of lessons learned and priorities reordered. She chose engagements connected to causes that had always mattered to her: early childhood development, mental health, the particular vulnerabilities of young people navigating a world that moves faster than any previous generation has had to navigate. She appeared at Wimbledon in July 2024, presenting the trophy to the men's singles champion. She attended a commemorative service at Westminster Abbey. She was photographed at her children's school events, the ordinary, unspectacular moments of parental presence that mean nothing to the outside world and everything to the three people who needed to see her there. She looked well, not in the performative sense, not the artificially bright wellness of someone managing a public narrative, but in the quieter, more convincing sense of a person who has come through something and is genuinely, carefully rebuilding. The cancer, as of early 2025, remains in remission. That word, remission, is not the same as cured. Catherine has been careful not to use language she cannot stand behind. Remission means that the cancer is not currently detectable. It means that the treatment worked. It means that the monitoring continues. The regular scans, the blood tests, the medical appointments that will mark her calendar for years to come, a permanent reminder of what the body is capable of and what vigilance costs. It means that the fear, while quieter, does not entirely leave. It settles into the background rather than the foreground. It becomes something a person learns to live alongside rather than something that defines every waking hour. But it also means this: she is here. She is present. She is a mother reading bedtime stories and supervising homework and attending school plays and doing all the unremarkable, irreplaceable things that her children need her to do. She is a wife, navigating with William the particular intimacy that crisis and survival create between two people who choose, when tested, to face the test together. She is a woman who has lived, in the space of a single year, through something that strips away every constructed layer of identity and leaves only what is actually there underneath. And what was underneath? What the diagnosis revealed when it removed the princess and left only the person turned out to be more than enough. There is a version of this story that ends with triumph, with a princess who faced the darkness and emerged victorious, crown restored, schedule rebuilt, the institution humming smoothly once again around her recovered presence. A clean narrative arc, a reassuring conclusion. The kind of ending that palaces prefer and publicists, design, and audiences, exhausted by uncertainty, often desperately want. That is not this story, because Catherine herself has refused to tell it that way. In the interviews and statements she has offered since completing chemotherapy, careful, considered, and far more personal than anything she produced in the decade before her diagnosis, she has been consistent about something that the triumphant version of her story would prefer to smooth over. She is changed, not repaired, not restored to factory settings, not returned to the woman who walked into the London clinic in January 2024 before the surgeons found what they found. Changed, permanently. In ways she is still discovering. She has spoken about the experience of serious illness as something that performs a kind of brutal editing on a life, that it removes, with a ruthlessness no human hand could manage, everything that was filling space without earning it, the obligations accepted out of habit rather than meaning, the performances maintained out of duty rather than genuine conviction, the version of herself she had been presenting to the world for so long that she had, in certain quiet moments, begun to mistake it for the only version that existed. The illness removed all of that, and, in its absence, something clarified. What clarified was not complicated. It was, in fact, almost embarrassingly simple. The children. William. The specific, irreplaceable texture of an ordinary day lived in full awareness of how easily it could have been the last one. The sound of Louis laughing at something nobody else finds funny. The particular weight of Charlotte's head on her shoulder during a film. The way George, at 12 years old, is beginning to show the particular seriousness of a boy who understands, without anyone having told him in those exact words, that his life will carry a weight most children never have to consider. These things, these small, private, unfilmable things. This is what the year of illness clarified as the center of her life. Not the engagements, not the approval ratings, not the carefully calibrated image of effortless grace that had taken a decade to construct and that she had maintained with a discipline the public saw as natural because she had never allowed them to see the effort it required. She has said, quietly, without drama, in the way she says things that matter most, that she no longer has the same relationship with perfection that she once had. That the version of herself who believed that composure was the same thing as strength has been replaced by a version who has learned, through the specific education of a cancer diagnosis, that they are not the same thing at all. That composure is a tool, useful, necessary in certain rooms, at certain moments, for certain purposes, but not of value, not an identity, not something worth sacrificing everything else to maintain. Strength, she has come to understand, looks different from the inside than it does from the outside. From the outside, it looked like the woman who never faltered, who appeared at every engagement with her back straight and her smile ready, who absorbed the pressure of royal life without visible complaint for over a decade. That woman existed. That woman was real, but she was not the full picture. The full picture includes the woman who sat in a garden in Windsor in March 2024 and looked into a camera and said the word cancer out loud, knowing that hundreds of millions of people were about to hear it, knowing that the carefully maintained image of invulnerability was about to be replaced by something far more complicated and far more true. That took more courage than any public engagement ever required. And in that courage, in that decision to choose truth over image, vulnerability over performance, humanity over the smooth operation of institutional narrative, Catherine did something that no amount of perfectly executed royal duty had ever quite managed to do. She became someone the world could actually see. Not the princess, the person, and the response, the extraordinary, overwhelming, cross-cultural, cross-generational response, revealed something important about what people actually want from those they place in positions of symbolic power. Not perfection, not the seamless performance of a life without cracks, but something harder to manufacture and infinitely more valuable: honesty, presence, the willingness to be, in the most public possible way, genuinely human. Catherine's cancer journey has, almost as a side effect of its own devastation, transformed the relationship between the British royal family and the public in ways that no communication strategy could have engineered. It has humanized an institution that has spent centuries cultivating mystique at the expense of connection. It has reminded millions of people who had begun to regard the royals as decorative relics of a previous era that the human beings inside the ceremonial roles are exactly that: human beings, subject to the same random cruelties of biology that make no exceptions for bloodlines or titles or the particular weight of a crown. And it has done something else, perhaps most importantly. It has given language and visibility to an experience that millions of people navigate every year in silence. The diagnosis that arrives unexpectedly, the weeks of waiting for results, the conversation with children that no parent rehearses for, the particular grief of treatment, not just the physical toll, but the existential reckoning that serious illness demands, the slow, non-linear return to ordinary life, the remission that is not a cure, but is, nonetheless, a miracle. Catherine spoke about all of it, not to generate sympathy, not to manage a narrative, but because she had come to understand, through the experience of receiving thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories in response to hers, that her willingness to speak was giving permission to others to do the same. That visibility in this context was not a vulnerability, but a gift. That is her legacy from this chapter. Not the return to duty, not the resumed schedule or the restored public presence, or the photographs that show her healthy and present at her children's milestones. Those things matter. But they are not the legacy. The legacy is the moment she looked into the camera and told the truth. The legacy is every person who watched that video and felt for the first time that their own experience of illness was not invisible, not shameful, not something to be managed in silence because the world prefers its public figures unbroken. The legacy is the reminder, delivered not from a podium or a policy document, but from a garden in Windsor, in a woman's own quiet voice, that the most powerful thing any of us can do, regardless of title or position or the weight of expectation placed upon us, is to show up honestly. To say, "This is hard. I am struggling, and I am still here." Catherine, Princess of Wales, is still here. Changed, scarred in ways not visible to cameras. Carrying, as every cancer survivor carries, the particular awareness of a person who has looked at their own mortality and chosen, with full knowledge of what that choice costs, to keep going. But here, present at the kitchen table, present at the school gate, present in the quiet of an evening when the children are asleep and the house holds only the sound of ordinary life continuing, the most extraordinary sound in the world, once you have understood how easily it can stop. She is not the princess the institution imagined it was creating when a girl from Bucklebury walked into a university in Scotland in 2001 and met the boy who would one day be king. She is something the institution could not have designed. She is real, And in a world that has more than enough of the polished and the performed and the carefully constructed, real is the rarest and most valuable thing of all. Catherine's story is not over. It is, in many ways, only now beginning. The chapter written not by duty or expectation or the long shadow of institutional tradition, but by the particular clarity that survival brings, by the knowledge of what matters, by the daily, ordinary, irreplaceable miracle of being present for the people who need you most. If her journey has taught us anything, it is this: that strength is not the absence of fear, that composure is not the same as courage, that the most powerful thing a person can do, princess or not, public figure or not, watched by millions or known only to a handful, is to face what is real and refuse to look away. She faced it. She is still facing it. And in doing so, she has given us all something far more valuable than the image of perfection she spent a decade maintaining. She has shown us what it looks like when a person chooses, against every instinct trained into them by years of public life, to simply be human. Subscribe for more untold stories of the people behind the headlines. And if Catherine's journey has touched something in you, if it has reminded you of your own fight or someone you love, leave a comment below. Because in every scar, in every honest word spoken into a camera by someone who had every reason to stay silent, there is a reminder that none of us faces these things alone.